If you had walked into the offices of Harwell and Crane on any given Wednesday in the 2 decades preceding March of last year, you would have found Gordon Marsh at the same desk he had occupied since his 31st year, third floor, east side, window that faced the parking structure rather than the street. He had been offered a different office twice. Both times he declined because the move would have disrupted the filing system he had built across 4 cabinets that nobody else fully understood, and disruption of that system would have cost his client something, and costing his client something was not a thing Gordon did. This is not a portrait of a man who failed to advocate for himself. It is a portrait of a man who had decided somewhere in his mid-30s that the work was the point, that the relationships were the point, that the title on the door was a secondary consideration to the voice on the other end of the phone when a client called in a crisis on a Thursday afternoon. He was right about that, mostly. He was wrong about what the institution would do with a man who believed it. 20 years compresses strangely when you try to account for it. There were 4 reorganizations, 2 ownership transitions, 1 rebranding that changed the letterhead but not the actual work, and somewhere in the vicinity of 11 promotions that went to people who had been at the company for shorter periods and understood the importance of being visible in meetings in ways Gordon had never prioritized. He managed accounts, large ones. He had a particular skill for the long relationship, the client who needed to be understood over years rather than quarters, whose trust was built through consistency rather than presentation. There were clients who had been with Harwell and Crane for over a decade specifically because Gordon answered when they called and remembered what they had told him the last time. The company knew this in the aggregate. They did not know it in any way that translated into structural protection when the algorithm ran its analysis in the 3rd quarter and identified positions for elimination based on metrics that did not include a column for institutional memory. The email arrived at 4:58 on a Friday afternoon, system generated, a template, clearly, the kind of document produced by software rather than authored by a person, which was evident in its precision and its complete absence of humanity. There was no name signed at the bottom. There was a reference number. Gordon read it twice at his desk. Then he printed it on the office printer, which still worked fine, and folded it in thirds and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and shut down his computer in the sequence he always used and drove home. Saturday was disorienting in a way he hadn't anticipated. He made coffee at 6:42, which was the time he always made it, and sat at his kitchen table and looked at the backyard for a while. The structure of his days had been external for so long that its removal felt physical, like a sound that had been present for years and had suddenly stopped, and the silence itself had a texture. He did not make calls that weekend. He did not draft anything. He allowed himself the full weight of it without trying to convert it into momentum prematurely, because he was 61 years old and had earned the right to sit with a thing before deciding what to do with it. It was in the 3rd week that he began to understand something the institution had never quite grasped about its own structure. The relationships he had built were not Harwell and Crane relationships. They were his. The clients had his direct number, which they had always called in preference to the main line. They knew his name in the way you know the name of a person rather than a vendor. He began making calls, not many, targeted. He had something real to offer, and the people he called already knew it, which made the conversations shorter and more honest than they might otherwise have been. Margaret Osei had been the operations director at Callaway Industrial for 11 years, which was exactly as long as Gordon had been their primary contact. When he called her on a Tuesday morning from the spare room of his house, she picked up on the 2nd ring and said she had been wondering when she would hear from him. The conversation was professional. She asked practical questions. He answered them with the specificity she had always valued in him. By the end of it, she had indicated, in the careful language of a person making a business decision rather than a personal gesture, that Callaway would be following their work to wherever he was doing it. He wrote everything down in the same notebook he had always used. The spare room became an office over the following weeks. A desk, the 4 cabinets, a printer. On the wall above the window, framed simply and without comment, the reference number visible at the bottom, the automated email. Not mounted in anger, mounted as information, a fact about how the story had turned, rendered visible so it could be looked at plainly and then moved past. The business was 3 months old. The outcome was not yet certain. Gordon carried that uncertainty the way anyone would. Practically, and without drama. There was real anxiety in the margins. There was also Margaret's account and 2 others, and the phone that rang often enough to matter. He answered on the 2nd ring. He always had.